Welcome to the Dark History Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Carter. In the heart of West Africa, Liberia, a nation scarred by 14 years of brutal civil conflict, became a breeding ground for some of the most terrifying warlords the world has ever seen. The violence of the Civil War was unparalleled, and among the most brutal players were the Cannibal Warlords. The story of these men and their reign of terror is a chilling testament to the depths humanity can plunge when law and order collapse. Amid the chaos, there emerged a man who would become one of the most notorious figures in Liberia's bloody saga, General Butt Naked, born Joshua Milton Blahi. Blahi was a tribal priest turned warlord who claimed to have been chosen by the devil himself to lead his troops into battle. His eccentricity was marked not only by his combat attire, which consisted solely of shoes and a weapon, but also by his ritualistic practices. Before each battle, Blahi and his fighters, known as the Butt Naked Brigade, would engage in cannibalistic ceremonies, consuming the flesh of innocent children in the belief that it would make them invincible. This may sound like the stuff of nightmares or a grotesque horror film, but for the people of Liberia, it was a grim reality. The power of belief in such rituals, combined with the fear these warlords instilled, created an environment where such horrifying acts became commonplace. Another infamous warlord was General Mosquito, known for his ruthless and brutal tactics. He acquired his moniker due to his ability to attack swiftly and without warning, much like a mosquito. His reign was marked by a similar kind of terror. Human rights reports document horrific stories of his soldiers engaging in acts of cannibalism, believing that consuming the flesh of their enemies would grant them supernatural strength and protection. These warlords, and many like them, held sway over vast territories, ruling with an iron fist. The fear they inspired paralyzed entire communities, and their cannibalistic rituals added another layer of terror to an already devastated population. They exploited local beliefs and superstitions to manipulate their followers and consolidate their power, leaving a trail of death, destruction, and trauma in their wake. The aftermath of the Civil War has left Liberia struggling to recover. The tales of these cannibal warlords continue to haunt the nation, serving as a chilling reminder of a dark chapter in its history. But understanding this history is crucial to comprehending the complex challenges Liberia faces in its quest for peace, stability, and reconciliation. The stain of the cannibal warlords' reign of terror is indelible, etched deeply into the nation's psyche, and their legacy continues to cast a long shadow over Liberia. The backdrop for this reign of terror was a Liberia ravaged by civil war. From 1989 to 2003, this small West African nation was enthralled by a conflict that was as much a battle for power as it was a manifestation of deep-seated ethnic and political tensions. As the government of President Samuel Doe crumbled, an array of rebel factions sprang up, each vying for control of the country's resources and its people. It was in this volatile environment that warlords like General Butt Naked and General Mosquito rose to power, their gruesome practices a testament to the depths to which humanity can sink in times of chaos and lawlessness. Liberia's civil war was marked by a cycle of violence and retribution, with each new faction committing atrocities in response to those perpetrated by its predecessors. Amidst this whirlwind of brutality, the warlords carved out their territories, using a potent mix of fear and superstition to maintain control. The rituals they performed, as grisly as they were not random acts of savagery. Rather, they were carefully orchestrated displays of power designed to instill fear and compliance in their followers and their foes alike. At the heart of these rituals was the belief in juju, a form of African spirituality that attributes supernatural powers to certain objects or rituals. Many of these warlords were juju priests, and they used this spiritual authority to justify and perpetuate their cannibalistic practices. They believed, and convinced their followers to believe, that consuming human flesh, particularly that of children or enemies killed in battle, would make them invincible. This belief was not confined to the warlords and their soldiers. It permeated Liberian society, creating a climate of fear and complicity that allowed these atrocities to continue unchecked. Ordinary people, terrorized by the violence and chaos of war, clung to their traditional beliefs as a source of comfort and understanding. In this way, the warlords were able to manipulate the spiritual fabric of the society to serve their own brutal ends. The Civil War ended in 2003 with the signing of the Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement. However, the wounds left by the war, both physical and psychological, run deep. The legacy of the Cannibal Warlords, with their grotesque rituals and their exploitation of fear and superstition, continues to haunt Liberia. The process of healing and reconciliation is complex and fraught with challenges, but it is a journey the nation must undertake if it is to move beyond this dark chapter in its history. To truly understand the reign of the Cannibal Warlords during Liberia's civil war, it is essential to examine the key figures who held these terrifying reigns of power. There were several, but perhaps the most infamous and influential were General Butt Naked, Prince Johnson, and Charles Taylor. General Butt Naked, born as Joshua Milton Blahi, was a self-proclaimed priest in the Krobo ethnic group in Liberia before the war. He earned his notorious nickname due to his belief that fighting naked made him invulnerable to bullets. Blahi led a faction of the United Liberation Movement of Liberia for Democracy, ULIMO, and was well known for his brutal and sadistic tactics, often involving cannibalism. He saw himself not just as a military leader, but as a spiritual one, using his understanding of juju to control and terrify his followers and enemies alike. Prince Johnson, another pivotal figure, was a former ally of Charles Taylor. However, their alliance fractured, and Johnson formed the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, INPFL. He is perhaps best known for his role in the capture and brutal execution of Liberia's then-president, Samuel Doe, an event he had filmed and distributed as a show of power. Johnson's use of terror was strategic, aiming to destabilize his enemies and create an environment in which his rule was the lesser evil. Charles Taylor, the most politically successful of these warlords, was the man who would eventually become president of Liberia. His National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL, was one of the most powerful factions during the war, and he ruled much of Liberia as a de facto state within a state. Taylor was adept at exploiting the fear and superstition prevalent in Liberia at the time, using it to consolidate his power and control over his territory. These warlords, each ruling their territories as personal fiefdoms, created a complex power structure held together by fear, violence, and spiritual manipulation. They operated outside of any formal legal system, their authority rooted in their capacity for brutality and their ability to control the narrative around their actions. Their cannibalistic rituals, carried out under the guise of spiritual rites, were at once a tool of terror and a symbol of their untouchability. They were not just warlords, they were demigods in their domains, their power fortified by the belief in their supernatural invincibility. But beneath this overarching narrative of power and terror, the warlords of Liberia were themselves deeply entwined in complex networks of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. The dynamics of these relationships were as unpredictable as the warlords themselves, and often just as deadly. Take, for example, the relationship between Charles Taylor and Prince Johnson. Initially, they were allies, united by a common goal to overthrow the Doe regime. However, their alliance was short-lived, crumbling under the weight of their individual ambitions and the lure of power. Johnson broke away from Taylor and formed his own faction, the INPFL, setting the stage for a bitter and bloody confrontation that would dramatically shape the course of the war. Johnson's capture and execution of President Doe, while initially seen as a victory for the rebel factions, only served to further fracture the already delicate alliances. Taylor, who had hoped to capture Doe himself and use him as a bargaining chip, was enraged. Johnson's actions had not only robbed him of a valuable asset, but also demonstrated his growing power and ambition. This event marked a turning point in their relationship, transforming them from uneasy allies into bitter enemies. This pattern of shifting alliances and betrayals was not unique to Taylor and Johnson. Throughout the Civil War, the warlords continually realigned themselves based on short-term tactical advantages, personal ambitions, and perceived threats. Blahi, for instance, initially fought under the banner of Ulimo, only to later break away and form his own faction. These complex dynamics contributed to the chaos and violence of the war, making it nearly impossible to predict or control. The warlords, in their pursuit of power, were willing to betray allies, slaughter enemies, and terrorize civilians. While the world watched in horror, the cannibal warlords of Liberia were shaping the country in their image. The brutality and terror they unleashed were not random acts of violence, but carefully calculated strategies designed to consolidate power, instill fear, and control populations. The country was their chessboard, and the people their pawns. The cannibalistic rituals, the public executions, the rampant violence, these were all part of a larger game, a horrifying spectacle of power and control. And yet, despite the brutality and chaos, these warlords managed to maintain their grip on power. They thrived in the anarchy they created, each one a king in his own right, ruling over a realm built on fear and violence. The question then arises, how did these men, these cannibal warlords, manage to rise to such terrifying heights of power? What was it about Liberia's social, political, and historical context that allowed for the emergence of such ruthless leaders? These are the questions we must grapple with as we delve deeper into the dark heart of Liberia's past. The roots of this brutality can be traced back to the country's fraught history, marked by social inequality and political corruption. Liberia was founded by freed American slaves in the 19th century. These Americo-Liberians, as they came to be known, established a ruling class that dominated the indigenous population, creating a formal caste system that set the stage for future conflicts. The Americo-Liberians controlled the country's resources, leaving the majority of the population impoverished and marginalized. This class structure persisted for over a century, culminating in a violent coup in 1980. A group of indigenous soldiers, led by Samuel Doe, ousted the ruling Americo-Liberian elite and seized power. However, Doe's rule was marked by corruption and nepotism, further deepening the country's ethnic and social divides. It was amidst this simmering resentment and disillusionment that Charles Taylor and his cohorts launched their rebellion, beginning a cycle of violence that would last for over a decade. The warlords exploited these social divisions and the widespread discontent to their advantage. They portrayed themselves as liberators, promising to overthrow the corrupt Doe regime and bring justice to the people. Their rhetoric resonated with many Liberians, who saw them as their only hope for change. This support allowed the warlords to recruit large armies, drawn primarily from the country's disaffected youth. These child soldiers, often no more than boys, were brainwashed, drugged, and forced to commit horrific acts of violence. The atrocities committed during the war were not merely the product of individual sadism, but strategic decisions designed to spread fear and maintain control. Public executions, mutilations, and cannibalism served as potent demonstrations of the warlords' power, intimidating enemies and keeping their own forces in check. The cannibalistic rituals, in particular, were steeped in Liberia's indigenous belief systems. The warlords believed that consuming the flesh of their enemies gave them supernatural powers, making them invincible on the battlefield. The international community's response to the crisis was slow and ineffective. The United Nations imposed an arms embargo on Liberia, but this did little to stop the flow of weapons into the country. Western powers, wary of getting embroiled in another African conflict, largely turned a blind eye, allowing the warlords to carry on their reign of terror unchecked. As the conflict dragged on, the warlords grew more entrenched, their power solidified by the fear and chaos they had sown. The country was in their grip, its future hanging in the balance. And yet, even in the face of such unimaginable horror, there were those who dared to resist, who refused to bow to the warlords' reign of terror. In the midst of darkness, there were glimmers of hope, brave individuals who risked everything to fight for a better Liberia. Among those who resisted were ordinary Liberians, who despite the terror and chaos found the courage to stand up against the warlords. They were mothers and fathers, teachers and tradesmen, people who yearned for peace, for a return to normalcy, for a future for their children. They formed grassroots movements, organizing protests and strikes, using their collective strength to challenge the warlords' authority. They faced immense danger, with many paying the ultimate price for their defiance. Yet their actions sent a powerful message, a testament to human resilience and the indomitable spirit of the Liberian people. The resistance also came from within the ranks of the warlords' own armies. Some of the child soldiers, pushed to the brink, began to question the warlords' reign. They saw the hollow promises for what they were and began to rebel against their masters. Some managed to escape, risking their lives to flee the warlords' camps. Others stayed, quietly sabotaging operations, providing information to the resistance, and doing what little they could to mitigate the warlords' reign of terror. In a different arena, the grim tales of horror playing out in the heart of Liberia began to resonate beyond its borders. Journalists and human rights activists, both Liberian and international, risked their lives to document the atrocities. Their reports, filled with graphic accounts of the warlords' deeds, were broadcast around the world. They shone a light on the brutal reality of the conflict, exposing the warlords for the monsters they were. Yet, even as the world learned of the warlords' atrocities, there was also a deafening silence. It was the silence of the Liberian government, which had long since lost control of the situation. It was the silence of the international community, which continued to dither and delay, its interventions too little, too late. And it was the silence of the warlords themselves, who hid behind a veil of superstition and ritual, their true motives concealed in the shadows of their cannibalistic rites. This silence, however, was not absolute. Amidst the cacophony of war, the whispers of resistance grew louder. Liberians were beginning to find their voice, their cries for justice echoing through the wilderness. The warlords, for all their power, could not silence them. The stage was set for the next chapter in Liberia's struggle, a chapter that would be written not by the warlords, but by the people they had sought to subjugate. It was in this climate of defiance and desperation that a new force began to rise, a force that would challenge the cannibal warlords and their reign of terror. This force was not a single entity, but a coalition of groups and individuals, each with their own motivations and methods, united by a common goal: to bring an end to the warlords' tyranny. One such group was the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, or LURD. Formed by exiles and refugees who had fled the warlords' reign, LURD was a rebel group with a mission. They sought not just to topple the warlords, but also to usher in a new era of peace and reconciliation. They were fierce fighters, their ranks filled with individuals who had witnessed the warlords' atrocities firsthand, and were ready to do whatever it took to prevent them from happening again. In the urban areas, underground networks began to form. These were made up of ordinary Liberians, shopkeepers, teachers, students, who were willing to risk their lives to oppose the warlords. They smuggled food and medical supplies to the war-torn regions, provided safe houses for those escaping the warlords' grasp, and disseminated information about the warlords' activities. Their actions, though small in scale, were monumental in their bravery and impact. Meanwhile, on the international stage, the media continued to play a crucial role. Journalists and human rights activists persisted in exposing the warlords' atrocities. The images and stories they brought to the world were horrifying, but necessary. They put a human face to the statistics and brought the reality of the warlords' reign into the living rooms of millions. Religious leaders, too, played a part. Christian and Muslim clerics alike used their pulpits to speak out against the warlords, condemning their actions as a perversion of faith. They provided spiritual and moral support to the people, giving them hope in the darkest of times. This collective resistance began to chip away at the warlords' power. The warlords, who had once seemed invincible, were now facing opposition on multiple fronts. They were no longer the only ones shaping Liberia's narrative. The tide was beginning to turn. The people of Liberia, long oppressed and terrorized, were rising up, ready to reclaim their land and their lives. As the resistance against the warlords intensified, the international community also began to take notice. In 2003, the United Nations Security Council established a special court for Sierra Leone to prosecute those who bore the greatest responsibility for the atrocities committed during the Civil War. A similar mechanism was set up for Liberia, called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These bodies were tasked with the daunting challenge of bringing the warlords to justice. The process was fraught with difficulties. Many of the warlords had entrenched themselves in positions of power, with loyal followers ready to protect them. Despite the obstacles, these international bodies remained resolute, determined to hold the warlords accountable for their actions. Among those indicted was Charles Taylor, the notorious warlord who had once ruled Liberia. The charges against him were extensive: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and violations of international humanitarian law. His trial was a landmark in international justice. It marked the first time a former head of state was tried and convicted by an international tribunal for crimes committed while in office. Yet, the pursuit of justice did not stop with Taylor. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission worked tirelessly, collecting testimonies, compiling evidence, and identifying other warlords responsible for the atrocities. Their work was not without controversy, however. Some criticized the Commission's mandate, arguing that it was too focused on retribution and not enough on reconciliation. Despite the criticisms, the work of the international bodies represented a significant step towards justice. The trials served as a stark reminder that even those in positions of power could be held accountable for their actions. They gave a voice to the victims, allowing their stories to be heard and their suffering acknowledged. The path to justice was long and arduous, but it was a necessary part of Liberia's healing process. The warlords had inflicted unimaginable harm on the people of Liberia. The trials were a way to ensure that those responsible were held accountable and that such atrocities would never be repeated. Yet, as important as these legal proceedings were, they represented only one aspect of Liberia's journey towards recovery. The country was still grappling with the aftermath of the warlords' reign, a legacy of violence and terror that had left deep scars on its people and its landscape. Healing these wounds would require more than just legal justice. It would require a concerted effort from all sectors of society, from the international community to the individual Liberian citizen. In the wake of the trials, Liberia was left to grapple with the lingering vestiges of the warlords' reign. The physical damage was evident. Towns and cities lay in ruin, infrastructure was decimated, and basic services such as healthcare and education were in shambles. But there was a more insidious damage. The psychological trauma inflicted on the population was deep and widespread. The culture of fear and violence that the warlords had propagated had left a lasting impact. To address this, various organizations, both international and local, embarked on initiatives aimed at healing and rebuilding. Non-governmental organizations and the United Nations launched programs targeting mental health, counseling survivors, and providing support for those traumatized by the war. Rehabilitation centers were established to help former child soldiers who bore the brunt of the warlords' savagery reintegrate into society. In the educational sector, efforts were made to rebuild schools and provide quality education, an integral step in breaking the cycle of violence and poverty. The international community offered financial aid and resources, recognizing the role of education in fostering a new generation that could lead Liberia away from the shadow of its past. The legacy of the warlords also presented a unique challenge for Liberia's governance. The warlords had thrived on corruption and lawlessness, creating a power vacuum that threatened the stability of the nascent democracy. To combat this, the government implemented stringent anti-corruption measures, bolstered law enforcement, and sought to instill a culture of accountability and transparency. Yet perhaps the most important aspect of healing and rebuilding was the role of the Liberian people themselves. Despite the horrors they had endured, there was a palpable resilience and determination among the citizens. They took an active role in their communities, participating in peace-building initiatives, voting in elections, and fostering a culture of reconciliation and unity. The legacy of the Cannibal Warlords of Liberia is undeniably grim, yet it is not the sole defining narrative of the nation. Amid the ruins, a new Liberia has been emerging, one that is striving to move beyond its past, to heal its wounds, and to forge a future defined not by the atrocities of the warlords, but by the resilience and spirit of its people. The road to recovery is long, and the scars may never fully heal, but with each step, Liberia is moving further away from the shadow of the warlords' reign, inching closer to a future of peace and prosperity. In the wake of this dark chapter in Liberia's history, numerous questions remain unanswered. For instance, how did these warlords manage to command such loyalty among their followers, despite their brutal and inhumane tactics? What circumstances led to individuals accepting, and even participating in, such grotesque acts of violence? These questions are deeply unsettling, yet they are essential in understanding the depths of the human psyche and the extent to which it can be manipulated in times of desperation and chaos. The story of the Cannibal Warlords of Liberia also raises complex questions about accountability and justice. Many of the warlords went unpunished for their heinous crimes, leaving a bitter taste in the mouths of those who yearned for justice. The ethical dilemma of whether to pursue retributive justice or to focus on reconciliation and rebuilding is a poignant one. There is no easy answer, and the choices made have profound implications on the psyche of a nation and its path towards healing. Reflections on Liberia's past inevitably draw one towards a contemplation of the inherent complexities of humanity. It is a stark reminder of how societal structures can collapse under the weight of conflict, creating a fertile ground for the rise of figures like the warlords who exploited the chaos for their own gains. It underscores the human capacity for brutality, but more importantly, it highlights the indomitable spirit of resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. The narrative of the Liberian people, their struggle and their resilience, stands in stark contrast to the horror inflicted by the warlords. It is a testament to the human capacity for hope, for rebuilding, for picking up the shattered pieces and creating something new. Their story reinforces the idea that even in the darkest of times, there is the potential for light, for change, and for a better tomorrow. In the end, the tale of the Cannibal Warlords of Liberia is not only a chronicle of a nation's descent into chaos, but also a narrative of its journey towards recovery, resilience, and rebirth. It is a sobering reminder of the atrocities that humans are capable of inflicting upon each other, but also a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and its capacity to rise from the ashes. Liberia's journey, though marred by trauma, is ultimately a story of resilience, hope, and the relentless pursuit of a better future. Thanks for listening. This has been the Dark History Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.